How are you guys doing? Okay, so I think we have a really lovely panel discussion planned for today, and we had a little bit of a change. Shekhar, whose picture you saw, was going to be there, but he had a family emergency, couldn't make it. So we replaced him with someone far better. We have Pari Natarajn replacing him, so this makes the panel discussion even more exciting. What I wanted to do is set up the context. The format that we'll follow is that we'll all just have some opening comments for about a minute or so each. I have a bunch of prepared questions that I will go through with the panelists. But unlike other panel discussions where sometimes the questions are kept for the end and we run out of time, we will intersperse the questions. In other words, I will ask them 2 questions, and then I'll take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and then I'll ask 2 more, and then we'll take a couple more from the audience. So I hope that you are engaged in this conversation, and that this panel discussion is worth your time. Before I get started, is Ram from Medtronics in the audience? If you are, I just want to see. Okay, all right. So this topic is a very interesting topic. It's about swarm disruption, and the word swarm comes from the swarm of bees. And if you were here at Confluence last year, just show of hands, how many were you here last year for Zinnov Confluence? Quite a bit. You might have heard in Pari's keynote, he had a lovely image of an elephant that was getting attacked by a bunch of bees. And while an elephant is a big and strong animal and knows how to fend off other predators, maybe like lions and tigers, it really doesn't know how to fight bees, especially when you're getting attacked from all sorts of different directions. So that is perhaps what is happening in our industry, in many, many different companies. And I want to basically explore some of those phenomena that might be happening, and hopefully at the end we'll conclude it with some thoughts on how do the existing elephants fend off the bees that we might be facing in our own industry or in our own companies. And so the format is we'll do some opening comments, get into questions. I'll invite questions from you guys, and then we'll wrap up. And we'll try to stay on time. I think we have about 45 minutes, and so we'll see if we can wrap it up and have an interesting conversation. Sanjeev, how about you? Why don't we get started with you? What are your views on swarm disruption? What are you seeing?
Okay, thanks, Tarun. So when I first read the synopsis of what this segment was going to be about, I thought it sounded very melodramatic. It sounded like startups were ganging together and sort of disemboweling or eviscerating the incumbents, and taking them down limb by limb and so on. It sounded very bleak. And I personally don't think it is that bleak. Disruption, whatever we mean by disruption, has been going on for quite some time. And if you look at the average number of years that a company spends, if you take S&P 500 as a measure of a company's longevity and the duration in that, it's a large cap index. The number of years that companies have been in S&P 500 has gone down from the early 60s, that was 40 years, down to 20 years now, and it's going down further. So it is a trend that has been going on. Certainly technology has accelerated that. But to give all the credit for all the disruption that incumbents are going through only to startups would be unfair, I think.
Sure.
Incumbents have their own set of challenges.
Yeah.
Mismanagement, lack of vision, inability to respond to events in time, sensing the market signals and all of that. So there's certainly that aspect of it. And then you should also look at the success rate of startups themselves. When we make it sound like they're killing everything around, 92% of startups fail. Of the 8% that succeed, 85% are actually either bought out or acquired to the incumbents that they're trying to disrupt. So 1.2% is the one that actually goes to IPO, and that is no measure of success either. Right? So that's my opening.
So the bees become the elephants.
Well, yeah. All I'm saying is I guess it's not that melodramatic.
Sure, sure. Pari, what's your view?
Yeah, I don't agree with Sanjeev. So if you look at a company like Ericsson when it started, right? It was started by true entrepreneurs, visionary who started the companies. But in those days, they didn't have the necessary infrastructure. They didn't have the investments to build such companies. And there are very few people like in Ericsson, Honeywell, BMC. Your founders of your companies build great organizations with a lot of struggle when they didn't have the support. But today's startups have enough support in terms of accelerators, in terms of venture capital funding and mentorship and necessary technology infrastructure which allows them to build highly scalable products in a very short time. And that's why we believe the startups which are coming in today have a much higher chance of disrupting larger companies compared to even 10 years ago when they didn't have the necessary infrastructure to drive that.
Yeah.
And second, when you look at swarm disruption, they're not disrupting a company like Honeywell or BMC or Ericsson, they're disrupting a specific product
Correct.
in your overall portfolio. And you look at who is running it. And the guy who is building this product and the startup is mortgaging his house and he's not paying his talent. They're working for the founder's vision. They're working 24/7. And that product is run in a multinational company by middle management team.
Yeah.
Right? The passion and vision for that particular product teams in two different organizations is very, very different.
Yeah.
And that's why we believe strongly that the disruption levels from startups is going to be much higher going forward than what it is.
Come back to that.
Yeah.
So
Akshay,
I thought I would respond to this whole disruption thing in the context of the industrial space where Honeywell plays in many, many different verticals. And if you think about Honeywell, we are big in aerospace. We're big in the turbochargers in automotives. We are in oil and gas in the refineries where we are providing process technology, catalysts, control systems. All of those verticals that we play in, there is a significant barrier to entry. Either it's because it's a regulated space, or we are talking about safety critical operations, or the scale of manufacturing is very significant. The precision manufacturing is, so for a startup to come in and disrupt in those verticals is very challenging. Where we are more vulnerable is, for example, in our home and building technologies. There we are more vulnerable because in the home automation space, the barrier to entry is lower, and we're starting to see a lot of disruption happening. Just as an example, thermostats, we had Nest come in for 5 years ago, Ecobee, and Honeywell was known for its thermostats, right? And so now we're starting to see a lot of competition coming. So in those areas where the barrier to entry is lower, it's a lot easier for startups to come in and start disrupting. And to your point, Pari, very completely agree that it's very targeted to one particular product line, but then they start to expand, and then they get scale. In the case of Nest, for example, they started with thermostats, they went into security systems, cameras, and then they got acquired by Google. So no longer were they a startup after that, right?
And they become mediocre after that.
Well, that we'll have to, we hope so from a Honeywell perspective, but so that's where we are more vulnerable.
Yeah, great. I think you answered the first question I was going to ask you, which was around, are there certain industry verticals that lend themselves more to this kind of disruption? And are there certain characteristics of it? So, for example, we talk about a lot of disruption coming across the board. Tesla is threatening the existing, but it is a giant versus a giant, right? But in this context, we're talking about a swarm of bees, right? So smaller players that come in. Are there certain characteristics that, Pari, this one is actually for you. Are there certain characteristics of an industry or that lends itself to more disruption by swarms than others? Do they have to be digital in nature, or can they be more brick and mortar?
Yeah, I think it depends on whom they are selling to. If you're selling it to a consumer, and consumers frankly are not loyal, right? They would go to a product which has better experience or cheaper and so on. So it's much easier to disrupt in a scenario where you're selling it to a consumer. But when you're selling to an enterprise, there's a level of a change required on the buyer side. Because let's say you are a large company selling it to another large company. Other large companies also going to take time to change.
Yeah.
And always they say that, hey, I won't get fired if I buy from IBM.
Right.
So that's mentality is still in a large enterprise. So when you're selling to a large enterprise, we see it's a struggle for the startup to build out. We're selling to a consumer, they're able to compete much better with a larger company.
Yeah. Now, what is really strange is that a lot of companies tend to buy other companies to build out a whole set of portfolio. And they're saying, we want to be a one-stop shop, right? And yet those same consumers who buy from the one-stop shop do not have any problem buying from startups. So, as an example, I might have a banker that I've worked with for my entire life, but if TransferWise comes in and says, I'll do international wire transfers for cheap, then I go to them for that specific function. But yet we see the phenomena continue. Startups come, startups get absorbed, and then you made a comment saying that then they become mediocre. Now, are you guys seeing, maybe this one is to you, Akshay, are you seeing any of this happening? What are your thoughts on this particular phenomena? Should the companies like Honeywell continue to build out portfolios, or accept the fact that startups are going to keep coming and disrupting and customers are not going to be loyal?
No, we cannot be complacent. I mean, if you look at, again, if I can go back to the Nest example, why did they get in? If you think about the traditional thermostat, it was very industrial looking, very clumsy, very difficult to program. And for an end user, it was a clear value proposition that the folks in Nest decided, right? The founder came from Apple, so it was that elegance of that thermostat was a very key element of their design. And they made it very, very user-friendly. And so those are the aspects, and they then connected that, to their gateways and finally to the cloud, right? So that enabled them to get a lot of additional value to the customer and also generate value for themselves, right? So what companies like what we are doing in Honeywell now, and in the last 2 years or so, we have really pivoted from being what we used to call ourselves a premier industrial to now a software industrial. And what we mean by that, we have actually changed our brand. We call ourselves the power of connected. Every single product that we are going to manufacture is going to be enabled with some sensing, connected to the gateway, to the cloud. So that's kind of our very, very relentless focus our CEO has pushed for. So every product we make will be connected. And so when you start to do that, then it becomes harder, because now we're playing in that space where startups were coming. So that's sort of our response in how we deal with these type of situations where startups are coming in. And the reason these startups are coming in and getting established is they have a clear value proposition that the incumbents' products were not offering, and that value proposition helps them to get in.
Sanjeev, I'm going to come to you. You said you'll come back to what Pari said earlier.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think.
So I'm not sitting here, we're in 2017, I'm not going to sit here and say that the startup threat can be ignored, not at all. All I'm saying is startups go through their own set of challenges, and the pace of disruption absolutely is dramatically higher than what it used to be. But to say that startups, when we call swarm disruption and make incumbents look entirely vulnerable or naked before these startups, that is the part that I'm challenging. I don't think it's as dramatic as that.
Though it could be happening, right? For example, if you look at the autonomous cars or self-driving cars, it's a phenomena that affects multiple industries, right? If you have autonomous cars, they don't get into accident, hence you don't have to insure them, and that then puts pressure on the insurance business. So some of these businesses are going to they're under threat anyway because of market phenomena.
Of course.
That makes them naked. And that is where, you start to see a whole bunch of...
Another trend we see is, if you take any industry value chain, right? Where is the profit pool in our industry getting captured? Let's take automotive industry.
Yeah.
The profit pool used to be captured at the General Motors, Ford, and so on. Now it's going into the marketplace companies, sharing Uber and Ola. Right? It's more and more the value and profit pool is getting captured close to the consumer.
Correct.
And everybody in the value chain, if you go and talk to a company like Bosch, right? They want, I want to have a direct access to the consumer. Right? So everybody in the value chain want to have, because they're all connected, every product is connected, every product is in the cloud, and they want to have connection to the customer because they know that that's why the profit pool is getting captured. Now we discussed before that the B2C companies are the ones which get disrupted.
Yeah.
In some level, across many of the industries, not in all industries, many of the industries, the companies in the value chain all become a B2C company.
Yeah.
Everybody is selling to consumer.
Yeah.
So the disruption from the startup will be much higher because you're not anymore a B2B company. So that's another add-on to the disruption acceleration.
True. So you are seeing product companies become more services companies. They don't want to sell the washing machine only. They want to sell a connected washing machine, which then allows them to have that access.
And not just not the OEM. The guy who's selling the chip inside, which goes into the washing machine, also wants a connection to the consumer.
Right.
So everybody in the value chain wants to connect to the consumer.
Yeah. So that goes back to what you said earlier, that this isn't they're not standing naked. I think that maybe they are. Maybe they are lending themselves a lot more to getting disrupted by different players.
Then we get into what, when I say standing naked, they're responding to it in different ways. And then you get into the question of, how much should incumbents invest in these kind of newer technologies? Because a failure rate, given that it's so high, then you have to do a trade-off analysis between should you do it yourself or should you let the idea develop and then buy it? And why not?
Okay.
You have to have, again, it comes back to having some sense of what's going on in the market, having some connect with what these startups are working on, keeping an eye on those things. Yes, of course, you have to look at innovating. Everybody has to innovate. It's not like that's only for startups, right? But then having to do it yourself always is not the answer, in my opinion. You can always choose to let the idea develop at somebody else's expense and then acquire it.
Okay, I'm going to open the, do we have mics? Any questions from the audience? Yeah. Oh, sorry, okay.
Hi, I'm Karthikeyan from Infinera.
Hi, Karthikeyan.
So we have heard quite a few times the word disruption today. So if you look at the prehistoric times, the biggest disruption that mankind has seen is the invention of stone tools. It has disrupted the survival of many other species. So that as the premise, disruption is nothing but that has been happening on a day-to-day basis. So the question really is, do we have to really prepare ourselves for the disruptions that we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow? Or do we have to just naturally adapt ourselves within the disruptions for our own survival? Yeah.
Is this question to a specific member on the...
Anybody in the panel?
So your question is, how do you prepare yourself for the disruption? Or do you have to?
No, the question is, do we have to prepare or do we have to naturally keep adapting to the day-to-day disruptions that we see?
Okay. I would say this goes back to, thinking of it from the industry that I'm in. I'm with Ericsson. We're in the telco space, telco vendors rather. Goes back to having a sense of what is going on in the market and being prepared to react and respond to events that you see unfolding ahead of you. And if I look at my sector, for example, in telecom, there is a lot of disruption going on there, absolutely. Our customers that we sell to, which are telcos like AT&T or Airtel and what have you, their revenues have been declining steadily with newer companies like Facebook, Google, all the over-the-top data that is going, which is not generating revenue. We can get into that as well. So when that disruption is going on for them, when our customers are getting disrupted, the squeeze gets passed on to us. And what they're looking to do is go from all the investments that they've been doing in their industry, which has been very CapEx heavy, they are looking to go virtualized. And these are signs that we started seeing about a decade ago that this would happen. So your question is, how do you prepare yourself? You keep sensing, analyzing these market signals. You start preparing for that shift which is eventually going to come. The virtualization is something I'm sure many of you have heard for years now. And that happening in the telco space has also been talked about for years now. But is it a reality? No. Is it close to being a reality? We hope so. Even now, we are doing lots of trials with customers. But if you ask me which one is ready to pull the switch and make the cut, we are still a couple of years away, is my opinion on that. But you have to stay connected with them. You have to help them through the transition and stay ahead that way so that you're ready to respond and react as and when the customer's demand evolves. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, maybe I can provide a perspective from my standpoint. I think it's both. It's not one or the other. Again, when I think about what we are doing in Honeywell, I talked about the fact that we're really looking at all our products to be connected. We're also driving changes organizationally to sort of create that internally, a sort of startup mindset, not only in terms of how we are organized, but also some of the behaviors that are expected from employees to have that entrepreneurial spirit, really to become more and more nimble as an organization and really focus a lot on how can we get disrupted, how should we be thinking about disruptions, and so on and so forth. So there's that piece that we have to do as a large corporation. In addition to that, though, we have to be also very cognizant that there are technologies that startups are creating that could potentially disrupt us. And for us to really have an understanding of what is happening, we need to be there. And so I don't know if some of you may be aware that a month or so ago, our CEO announced the launch of a venture capital business within Honeywell. We would never have done that 5-10 years ago. So it's going to be based in Silicon Valley. It's about $100 million type of investment initially. But the whole purpose is to really be out there funding startups, where we think we have a play that helps our businesses grow. So my point is that it has to be both. It cannot be one or the other, because disruption can happen from either way, and we have to be internally focused and also externally focused.
Sure.
I just have a short point. Timing and disruption is very, very hard, right? And that's why most large companies, they know what's going to happen. They invest quite a bit in that area, but it's very difficult to time. So it's very important to have a culture which can change rapidly when you know something is happening. And can you move a significant amount of resources into a specific area that change is happening? And that is important in the culture.
Yeah, yeah. I think smart companies do both. They basically incubate some technology, and they're also looking for acquisition targets. And they basically pick the best of the both when, best of those two options or more if they have many more, to be able to capitalize on the disruption. Okay, there's one more question. I saw one more hand up there. Yeah. Can you give him the mic? Can you stand up so they can see you? Yes. He's...
Okay. I think my question got partly answered in the answer that the Honeywell gentleman gave.
Okay.
But also, I think I have an extension of that. Essentially, I think I've heard words like being rapid, being agile, or adapting to change, but how do you institutionalize that in very large organizations? I think using the same metaphor, how does an elephant take the agility of a bee?
Go ahead, Pari.
So there is, we haven't seen one single answer in terms of how companies are doing. I'll give you 2 or 3 ways the large companies who have been around for the last 200 years have done it. If you take a company like Siemens or a company like IBM, Procter & Gamble, right? One way they do this is almost like, you take your arm and replace your arm with something else. So they sell off a major chunk of business and go and buy $5-10 billion businesses and bring it inside. What Samsung is doing today, they know that autonomous car is going to be big. Spend $8 billion to buy Harman. So one way is not to really make big bets by large companies. The other way is you internally incubate and try and buy a pearl of startups and stitch together a business.
Yeah.
And the third one is really trying to incubate a new idea internally a company. The first one has the highest level of success. Second is, and the third has the lowest level of success based on what we have studied large companies.
Yeah, and some companies do that really well. Cisco does that whole incubation and bringing them in extremely well. Okay, I think you have a question. Can you give him a mic? We'll take this question, then I'll go back to my questions, and then I'll come back to you guys later. Yeah, hi.
Sorry. I think the industries cannot be working on always the disruptive policies. They're always worried about what you are trying to do. Now the world has always come through several copying. The copying, they say, the more we copy, the more creative we get. The faster we copy, the more creative we get. Copying is the starting point of creativity. And the industries must look at, it's not where you take things from, it's where you take them. So there are many issues. I think every day technology is changing, every minute technology is changing. I mean, this is the way that we should work. And then everybody wants to have a reliability. For example, you want to take an equipment from a motor from 0.6 reliability to 0.8 reliability, it costs 8 times, according to statistical equations and all that. People cannot afford. Why? So they would be satisfied with lower. The problem is everything is made too costly, this affair, by these disruptive policies. Everybody wants to copy the same thing and something they would like to put and compete. And I think the society requires different type of approach also in the product. We always look today, all big bazaars and other things, and all the old small shops are all gone.
Sure.
I
So
think
do you have a
this-
question?
I have this question.
Yes.
I think disruptive policy you should consider from this viewpoint.
Say that again?
Disruptive policy
Yes.
should not bother you so much
Should
all the
not-
time.
Uh-huh.
And you should stick to certain things and become innovative. Even yesterday's discussion also, innovation people have not understood very clearly.
Uh-huh.
Innovation came from the invention. That word was given because any invention which is made to the good to the society became an invention. That means any incremental or whatever inventions you are going to give, that means you are questioning the invention itself because you said technology is not perfect. So even the inventions that were discoveries were made, they were not perfect. That means we have to look into that fundamental itself, not some incremental, etc., and other thing, thinking the all inventions were always the 100% correct.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your comments. Let's go back to some of the questions I have here. Now, this one you mentioned right at the start that a swarm indicates that it is a coordinated attack to bring down a common enemy, right? So all of the bees are attacking the same elephant, but startups don't seem to work like that. Or are you starting to see, I'll leave this question to anybody. Pari, you may have some because you track startups so closely. Maybe you have a viewpoint on this. But this one is for you. Are you starting to see any collusion between startups that are going after the same common enemy? Are you starting to see alliances get formed, at least in your industry or anywhere else that you may have read about?
Generally speaking, no. Every startup is eventually going to be measured by what they're doing for their investors and shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in that sense, they're looking to promote their own interests and be successful independently. When you talk about alliances, yes, in my industry, there's a whole open source movement that is going on.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not necessarily just a startup thing.
Yeah.
Companies get together, they contribute to open source. So the idea is to level the playing field by making some of the common infrastructure elements more of a commodity by contributing to open source, common standards across. Part of it is driven by customers and their demands, and a large part of it is driven by that. So short answer is I don't see a swarm where startups ganging up against each other towards a common enemy.
Are you seeing anything?
Yeah, I agree with Sanjeev. We don't see the startups combining together, but the investment thesis of large venture capitalist firms, if you look at Henderson Horowitz, the thesis is in areas where there is inefficiency because the large companies in those areas have not innovated.
Mm-hmm.
And they fund companies in that specific area, right? And individual companies will compete differently, but the investment thesis is, okay, I'm going to fund companies which should go and disrupt this specific industry.
Right.
And that's how they combine together, not individual companies.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I think we are going to run out of time, so I'm going to see if there's one more question from the audience, and then we'll get to the closing. Go ahead.
I'm Guru Raj from Allscripts. The question what I have is, we're talking about the disruption. So how does any company or the entrepreneurs or VCs measure the success of a disruption? A startup, when it comes up with an idea, when it starts implementing, so the success, is it by getting acquired by some other company, or is it the market share, or is it the purpose of that particular startup?
I can take a shot at it. Venture capitalists purely look at it based on how much money they can make from the startup. As simple as that, right? So they want to fund companies which can be $100 million or a company which can be $1 billion in valuation. That's what they want to fund. If you're an entrepreneur, you don't necessarily always have to build a company which is going to be $1 billion. Right? So you can also build a company which is a very niche market, but a very interesting product. So how an entrepreneur measures success is very different from how a VC would measure success.
Do you guys want to add?
I think it's no different in a large corporation.
Right.
I mean, you manage your portfolio, and every business puts together a growth plan, for their business, and the ones that have the highest return are the ones that get funded. So I think internally in the company as well, it's a similar kind of thing. It's all measured by financial impact to the businesses.
I think the entrepreneur might look at it different. They may look at it from a sense of purpose. They're solving a real world problem. But without the people who fund the startups, the startup's not going to go anywhere. And so I think two things come together. There is a big sense of purpose from the founding team that's trying to really make a difference, and then there are the venture capitalists and others that come in that look at it purely from a financial standpoint.
Only thing I would add to that is, I mean, the ideas that would see traction in a large company versus in a startup, of course, is going to be dramatically different.
Yeah.
A company that is making 20 billion in revenue, a $50 million idea may not be worth going after.
Sure.
Whereas for a startup, that is basically what it is. So.
Yeah. Are you, Pari, again, you track startups very, very closely. Are you seeing specific startups that seem to be making a bigger difference in a specific industry? Again, I'm going back to the chart you had put up last year. And you had some very specific example, like in Wells Fargo, you had a bunch of people that were going after investment banking, and some were going after mortgage businesses and stuff like that. So are there companies that we should be aware of?
Not specific companies. It's based on areas. For example, we did a study looking at startups in artificial intelligence. Looked at 2,000 companies. And we found that there are three areas where companies are, right? Largely in fintech, marketing, and healthcare, where they're using AI to drive more innovation. Then you have AI platforms. In those areas, we found the larger companies like Google and others, IBM, they're leading the game, but there are a few startups. These startups are funded at $100, $200 million.
Wow.
These are startups, right?
Yeah.
But there's a big bets. So there are a few startups, but funded quite heavily. And you go up the stack in the application area, there are lots of smaller startups, funded anywhere between $5 to $50 million across these sectors.
Yeah.
So in each industry, we see it different.
What is the role that technology is playing in this? In this conference itself, we would have heard so many different buzzwords. And as I meet customers, they're asking about our strategy, artificial intelligence, machine learning, cognitive behaviors. There is IoT, there is big data. It's just so much of buzz around technology. What is the role that these technologies are playing in your mind in disrupting, let's say, your industry? Actually?
Yeah, very significant, I would say, especially as we go from very much a product-oriented company and we expand our presence to being the more connected product, and we get into the services and other features that kind of provide enhanced customer value. And in order to keep track of that, we actually have just recently created a advanced technology group to really be out there focused on what is happening from a technology front that we should be tracking and partnering with companies, investing in companies, acquiring companies, things like that, so that we can get some advantage there. It's a huge initiative. It's no longer just focused on the core verticals that we play in and just focused on the technology that we excel in, but also looking at what is happening, whether it's artificial intelligence, deep learning. The things have changed so much in the last few years, and they continue to change, at a very, very accelerated pace, that if we don't keep track of it proactively and figure out how that could potentially impact us, we would really be not doing ourselves a favor.
What is the horizon for them? I mean, there used to be a time like when our CTOs used to look out 5 years into technology.
Yeah, very good question. In our strategic plan, in the past, we've always looked at 5 years out. But our new CEO, Darius Adamczyk, while we look at 5 years, a very incredible amount of focus on 1, 2, 3 years, because things are changing so rapidly that you don't know what's going to come 5 years from now.
Yeah.
So we're starting to think shorter cycle because of the changing, technologies that are happening.
Shorter cycles about like 18 months or
Yeah,
longer,
yeah.
or 3 years? Or
No more than 2 to 3 years is probably
2
the
to
max.
3 year horizon is the max
Yeah,
that you're
yeah.
looking. It's more pragmatic.
Yes.
Like, take the technology question if you have time.
We have
From a slightly different angle, not so much that, yes, there's IoT and artificial intelligence and all that, certainly, but when Pari opened Tarun, you asked him this question about what kind of industries are seeing this disruption, and the answer was B2C largely, right? And it'd be interesting to look at what the reasons are for that. And if you look at some of the trends that have contributed to disruptions increasing as a result of these things, right? One is the handheld itself in everybody's hand. The internet is in everybody's hands. And you get to try out applications far more easily. The distribution channels have opened up much more than they ever were before.
Yeah.
So that is one part of it. Then we also talked about the loyalty that in the B2C space, and especially so I believe the millennials, when they experiment with the product, there's the brand loyalty, so to speak. There's no adherence necessarily to a particular brand from before. So if something fits your needs, meets a particular aspect of what you need, and it does it well, then they share that through social media, again, shared by everyone. So for a product to gain visibility is that much more quicker over the last, I would say, 15 years or so, as some of this internet mobility and all of that has picked up. So that is one part of it. And then for startups, the barrier to entry for startups is significantly reduced with the arrival of things like cloud. You lease parts of it, you don't have to own.
Right.
And that's where you experiment, you fail fast, move on, try something else. So.
Yeah.
So technology is certainly what has caused this acceleration.
Right. While money is available, the amount actually needed to do a startup is far lesser anymore.
Yeah,
absolutely. And the
We
distribution.
have created this disruption lens framework. Usually when you study a competition, you study Nokia. You know how to study one single company.
Yeah.
But how would you study 200 together? Right? We have come up with a framework which allows you to study these companies based on, so you want to understand the technology trend in the industry. One way to study is your direct competition. Other way to study 200 different startups. Where are they getting funded? What kind of people are they hiring?
Yeah.
Where are they getting customer traction? That gives you, because they are building something to make revenue in the next 2 quarters.
Right.
They're not building something for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
That also gives a good indication to add on to your technology research to see where you should be investing for the short-term technology-wise.
Okay, great. So we are almost at the end of the session, so I'm just going to ask the last question, which I think is most people in the room, or maybe some of them are disruptors in the room, and maybe many of them are working for startups that are disrupting. But we work for large companies. What advice do you have for incumbents, and we go across the table, what advice do you have for incumbents that are facing this kind of disruption, not a giant to giant, but beast to giant? Do you have any advice on what we should be doing, MNC should be doing?
You mean for other incumbents or?
In your industry, for example, how are you dealing with the challenge of startups?
Okay. Yeah, so I think fundamentally we are, as I said, organizationally and culturally, we are no longer behaving like this large, giant, corporation. We have, in Honeywell, created what we call gold enterprises, Honeywell Gold Enterprises. These are smaller groups within the businesses, within the 4 large segments that we are in. And that is almost like a greenhouse or a startup type organization under a general manager that have full accountability for their line of business, very much focused on breakthrough initiatives, understanding the disruptors that are happening, and giving them a lot more autonomy as part of this larger, being part of that larger corporation. And with that kind of a mindset, you sort of create that startup type environment organizationally. And then the second piece is the culture. The culture in large companies sometimes is so different. And in the last 15 years or so, as we have done very well as a corporation under our previous CEO, Dave Cote, we had something called 12 behaviors, and that's how we evaluated everyone's performance on results and behaviors. Recently, under our new CEO, we have a new set of behaviors, very significant change for us organizationally. But if you look at those 8 behaviors, it's very much focused on entrepreneurial spirit. Be bold, be a zealot for growth, be courageous, have that hunger, kind of really creating a different mindset within the organization and an expectation. And those are the kinds of things that I would say for other MNCs who are not doing that, we really need to embrace that. Otherwise, we're going to get disrupted as a company. So that's what I would say.
Okay, great.
I just say use our disruption lens framework to understand startups. You can talk to anybody in Zinnov, both will help you.
Great.
I would say it is a lot of it is about culture, everything that Akshay just shared. And we, as Ericsson, are going through a similar journey. I mean, we're a company that's 140 plus years old, and we have survived different stages of disruption over these last 140 years. We're going through one right now, and we are going through a very similar journey within Ericsson in terms of just the culture of more risk-taking, saying no to things which are having a shorter patience window for basically fail fast. Do it. If it's not working out, move it out, move on to something else. So, yeah.
Okay, and I think, I have some very similar experiences that I don't think it's hard to change the culture of an organization. So you really have to assess what the culture of the organization is and figure out what works for you, because there are multiple things that do work. There is a merger and acquisition strategy. If you're good at acquisitions, do acquisitions, acquire innovation. If you're good at having a culture of entrepreneurism, then maybe you can set up incubators. Those, I think, are a little bit harder because the bigger you are, the smaller the revenue from an internal startup does not attract the general manager. So if you're doing $2 billion of business and you got a startup that's only going to give you $2 million in the first year, that's not very attractive, and hence a lot of ideas get shot down there. And then there is, of course, the model which Cisco has done really, really well, which is spin off, make an acquisition, they incubate outside of the company, and then they acquire after it reaches a certain size if they're successful. So there are many, many models. I think the key is to know what works for you and then put those in place. So with that, I think we will end this discussion. Thank you very much for your candid conversation. I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you.